I'm a 17-year-old guy currently living in Phoenix, Arizona. This incident took place around 6 months ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this stuff long enough to realize what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, and usually with a lot of trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail I was taking was an 8-mile loop through a canyon. Pretty simple, in and out, overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel in his part left me on my own. So with a packed bag and a car ready to go, I decided to go on my own. Not leaving the house on time, and some trouble navigating rough forest roads, I didn't arrive to the trailhead until around 5:45 p.m., which for those of you who don't backpack, this is a very big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike until I arrived at my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast, so I figured if I move quick enough, I could get at least 2 to 3 miles in before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail on my own with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark by itself is scary, especially for where I was and being on my own. Eventually it got so dark I could only see where my headlamp was pointing, and that's when I figured I needed to stop and get a camp set up, with only using the headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast. I ended up in a less than ideal spot, but there were some burned pieces of woods and the remains of a fire circle. So it looked like people had been there before, but definitely not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me and was able to find some dry wood, and I got the fire going. I got my tarp set up and cracked open a can of chili mac I had brought for myself and was very much looking forward to eating. I was feeling good, my camp was set up, and my food was on the fire. The feeling and uneasiness from the hike-in had almost gone away, but it was still there, a side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened, I have to explain to you how my camp was set up. The site I had picked was the small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods and have a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything on the edge of that circle and past it are pitch black. I was sitting on the ground and near my fire, eating my dinner, when a small rock, about the size of a marble, was thrown in my camp. I looked at the tiny rock and shocked, as I was positive that I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light on and towards the area where I had seen the rock come. But due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet. I spent the next 15 minutes in disbelief as I scanned the tree line that surrounded me, searching for what or whoever had thrown the rock, not daring to stray too far from the fire, that in hindsight offered me a false sense of security. After sitting back down and spending the rest of my time on high alert, and was able to convince myself that I had somehow kicked the rock or had fallen from a tree, I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible if you weren't listening for them, but they were there. Still in a sleepy daze, I listened as the rustling of leaves got harder to hear, as I assumed they were moving away from me. I went to grab my handheld flashlight that I had left next to me when I had fallen asleep, but the more I looked, the more scared I got, as I came to realize that it was no longer there. I stood up in my sleeping bag and ducked out of my tarp and looked around. I was able to see a light off in the woods. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet away. It was my flashlight lying on the ground in a pile of leaves. This is one of the few moments in my life where I had almost soiled my pants. The flashlight that I had left sitting right next to me when I had fallen asleep a few hours ago was now 15 feet away from me, past the tree line in the woods. I hurriedly slipped my boots on, clutching my knife in my other hand and keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options: stay there and wait out the night, or attempt a 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whoever was out here with me was definitely going to have a better advantage if I was out on the trail without a light, so I decided to stay at the camp and wait out the night there. Eventually it came back. I could hear walking through the woods. It was far off, but I could hear it. It sounded like someone leisurely walking by, like they were on a stroll without a care in the world. Sometimes they would walk too far and I would loose the sound of its steps, but then an hour later, maybe two, it would return, still faint as ever. This went on for 3 or 4 hours until I listened to the steps get closer and closer until there are about 7 feet from me. At this point, the fire had gotten very small as I had run out of wood in my pile. The footsteps stopped and everything went totally silent. I sat there, still for 2 hours, clutching my knife in my hand and prayed that I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that until the sun cast enough light that I could see that I was alone in my campsite. I packed my things and sped, walked the 3 miles back down the trail that I had taken. I arrived at the empty dirt road where my car was parked and nearly sprinted to it as I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in and drove, and didn't stop until I had put at least 20 miles between me and that place. I stopped at the gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I read what was written in the dust on the back window of my car: "Sleep well." A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this is the weirdest and scariest by far, so I thought I'd share. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains, and do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. To set the stage for this story, we must go back to the far-off year of 1988. The location is the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. I was 10 years old, and with me was my mom, dad, my best friend, and our golden retriever, Ollie. We were very much an outdoor family, and we had many camping trips before this and since. But to this day, when I think about it, I still remember the terror I felt that weekend so long ago. After a brief talk with my father recently, it kind of came back to the front of my mind. He was also able to fill in a few details that I had forgotten. This holiday was like many others. We packed up the station wagon with everything we needed for a hike into one of our favorite links to camp at. To make this trip even more exciting for me was the fact that it was my birthday weekend, and I got to pick this lake after we arrived at the trailhead and got our backs on. My dad got his sidearm out and strapped it on his belt. In Oregon, open carry was permitted in national forests, and my dad had always had a gun in his hip while in the woods, which always added a sense of security. We had a close call with a bear one time, in which it really came in handy. The lake was about a 4-mile, moderate hike through some thick forest, but the trail itself was well maintained and never very busy, so it was going to be a very pleasant hike in. We started off on our hike, and back in the 80s, it wasn't uncommon to have your dog off-leash on the trails in the forest, so we had let Ollie run and do her thing. She was a good dog, and she never ran off too far for long or jumped on people. She did love people, though. And speaking of people, we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail after about 2 miles in on the hike, which was nice since it was just all of us, talking, laughing, and just enjoying the nature. My best friend and I started a hike ahead of everyone else because we were so organized and excited about finding the first and best tent spot. Once we got to the lake, Ollie was bounding ahead of us and having a great time too. We were about 20 yards ahead of my parents when Ollie stopped dead in her tracks. I thought that she maybe saw a chipmunk or something, maybe a bird, but her hackles came up and she let out the lowest of growls. She never growls, so we stopped walking, and I thought maybe a bear or deer or something was just off the trail and she had saw or heard it. We immediately started walking backwards and my parents caught up to us. My dad had asked us what was going on, and I told him that Ollie is up the trail and is growling at something. He tells us girls to stay back with my mom and he walks ahead to where Ollie was at on the trail. My dad gets up to her and starts looking around. I hear Ollie whimper a bit while looking off the trail. My dad comforts her and he calls her back and then walks back to us. He says it must have been an animal and that he didn't see anything right off the trail or ahead of us. He says to let him take the lead, and we continue to hike. It didn't take long before it was forgotten, and Ollie and the rest of us are all having a good time. Again, we arrived at the lake, and much to my delight, there was no one else there camping. The water was clean and blue, and the shade from the trees made the whole scene just perfect. My friend and I found the best spot to set up our tent, and my parents followed. After we had set up camp, my folks went off to fish just down the hill, while my friend and I took off with Ollie to walk around to the other side of the lake to catch salamanders. We only made it about an eighth of a mile when Ollie stopped and yet again started to growl. We stopped and looked around, and we had heard the sound of brush rustling. Then right in front of us, a man walked out of the trees. Ollie stayed right by our sides and started to bare her teeth. He was much taller than my dad, so at least 6'4", was very skinny, but he had broad shoulders. He was clean cut, and he was wearing black jeans and a white polo shirt with loafers. I mean, he did not look like he had hiked at all, or was even dressed for the outdoors. He almost looked like he came out of church. We just stood there trying to process the situation when Ollie began to bark. The guy just stood there not moving, and he smiled like the creepiest smile ever. It felt like someone who thought that was what a smile was supposed to look like. Ollie kept barking, and this got my parents' attention, and they looked up to us and called out for us to come back. We complied, and we started to walk back towards them. My dad had met us halfway, and he told us to go back to the campsite and that he was going to go talk to this guy. We got back to our camp, and my mom sat with us. I could hear my dad asking the guy if he needed help or if he was a fellow camper who had just set up a camp away from the lake. My dad was being polite and calm, but I could see he was on guard and trying to fill out the situation. Now is the time to mention that my dad was ex-Army, and he can be very intimidating when needed. The conversation continues. The guy told my dad he was just on a walk and that he didn't mean to intrude on us. The guy says goodbye and walks back into the woods. My dad walks back to camp, and he sat down and he told us that he thinks the guy's just a yippy camper and that he doesn't know too much about the outdoors. But my dad did say that he got a weird vibe off of him and that he would definitely be keeping an eye out for him. Ollie stayed by our side and was just calm. Yeah, she kept looking towards the direction the guy went. A bit more time goes by and we have a nice campfire going, and the sun was just starting to set. We had cooked some dinner and we made some s'mores. Afterwards, my friend and I decided to go to our tent and read some books and tell each other some scary stories. Ollie followed us to the tent and laid right outside of the door. My parents walked to the lake to sit, have a beer, and just generally chill. They were never more than about 50 yards away. Not long after my parents walked away, I heard an Ollie start to growl, then we heard footsteps coming from the woods behind our tent. My friend and I turn off our flashlight and go quiet to listen. The footsteps stopped right at the edge of the woods. We then hear heavy breathing and a grunting sound. Ollie starts to bark, and we then hear the footsteps. Retreat to the woods. Ollie whimpers a bit, and I then hear my parents walking back to the camp. I go out and I tell them what happened. My dad said that he heard Ollie barking, and that's why they came up. I asked my dad what the hell we should do, what's going on, and if that strange guy was the one creeping around. He tells me that we'll see about moving camp in the morning, since we still have 3 days left on the trip, and that nothing's really happened, so we aren't just leaving. But he said that we'll play it by ear and just be a little more vigilant, and that if something changes, we'll decide what to do next. He tells us to try and get some sleep, and we all turn in for the night. The next morning, we all get up and have breakfast. After breakfast, we head down to the lake to fish. It was a beautiful day, and we were having so much fun. The events from the day prior were almost forgotten. We decided around lunchtime that we would go for a short hike to the waterfall that's just up from the lake. We were only gone for about an hour, and when we came back, we found our tents open and our sleeping bags dragged out to the ground. My dad tells us to hang back with my mom while he goes to investigate. He comes back and he says nothing is missing, but it wasn't an animal that did it. He says we should break camp, hike back to the car, and find another spot to camp for the next couple of days. I could tell that my dad wasn't wanting to frighten us, but I could hear the urgency in his voice. I was very disappointed, but if it meant we can enjoy the rest of the trip and not worry about some creep messing with us, then it was worth it. We broke camp and started our hike back. Dad was in the lead, and we were double timing it, and we made it back to the car in record time. As we walk over to the car, we see one of our tires was flat. Not a big deal. We always had a spare. But when my dad bent down to start taking the logs off, we swore it was not just a flat. Someone slashed the tire. Dad changed the tire in record time, and we threw everything in the car. And he goes to turn on the car, but it wouldn't start. Dad starts swearing, gets out of the car, and pops the hood. It turns out someone had took out our spark plug wires. Know that old cars like that Chevy wagon didn't have internal hood release. You could just pop the hood from the outside. Dad slams the hood, says some very colorful words, and kicks some rocks. We were stuck, and no one else was at the trailhead. We were stranded. My parents are calm under pressure, and after a few minutes of discussion, it was then decided that Dad would start walking down the road until he could hit a ride to town and go to the auto parts store. Mom and the rest of us were going, stay with the car and look for someone to hopefully pull into the trailhead and help us. A few hours go by, and no one else has come to the trailhead. It's starting to get hot at this point, and we're all getting very hungry and tired. My mom makes us some lunch, and we go sit under a tree to cool off. Ollie's by our side, and very calm, but then we hear a voice. Ollie leaps up and starts to whimper. The creepy guy from yesterday comes down the trail and is asking my mom if we need help. My mom tells him we're fine, that it's all being settled, and that my dad, her husband, will be back soon. The creep then tells her that his camp is close, and he's parked on the old fire road that's near the lake, and he asks us if we would like to come back to his camp and wait until my dad returns. My mom sternly tells him no, and then we'll just wait here, but thank you anyway. He does not like this. He tells my mom that it's not safe out there for a pretty lady and two young girls. My mom, like my dad, is no pushover, and she asserts herself again that we don't need any of his help, and to please just leave us alone. The guy just stands there, smiles wide, and then just turns around and leaves. As you can imagine, my mom is visibly shaken, and us girls were just a bit scared. My mom comes over to us and tells us that we need to stay close, don't wonder, and that we'll all be okay. My friend and I are really kind of freaked out at this point, and we're just hoping that my dad will make it back soon. After about 30 minutes, the creepy guy comes back. This time, though, he's not alone, and he has a slightly younger guy with him. The other guy is dressed as a yippie camper and had a very stern look on his face. My mother stands her ground as they approach. Ollie starts to low growl, and her hackles go up. The two guys flank us, and one of them flashes a gun tucked into his belt. The older guy tells us that we need to go with them, and that they were not asking. My mom backs up next to us, and without taking her eyes off of them, reaches to her belt and pulls out her Bowie knife. My mom then said we will not be going anywhere, and that they need to leave now. The two men didn't even flinch at this, and they said we will come with them, or they will hurt us. Right at this moment, though, Ollie goes from just growl to now barking, and she then puts herself between us and them. This makes the guy stop. My mom then yells that they need to leave now. They start backing up, and right at that moment, we then hear a truck pulling into the trailhead parking lot. At the sight of the truck, the guys start to walk away very fast, then disappear right into the tree line. The truck was a forest ranger, and he had my dad with him. My dad jumped out of the truck and ran over to us asking if we're okay. The ranger came over and asked who those men were, and also asking if we're okay. My mom explained everything that happened while my dad hugged us girls, then tell us we'll all be okay. The ranger takes off looking for the men. My dad tells us that he was about 5 mil from the town when the ranger picked him up, and he then took him the rest of the way to buy the needed part for the car. Then he drove him back to the car, which leads us to the present moment. After hearing what happened, my dad was pissed and he really wanted to find the guys who tried to kidnap us and had been terrorizing us for the past 24 hours. The ranger came back, and he told us that he almost caught up to them, but they had sped away in a truck with a camper in tow. They had been parked behind a small ridge behind the lake on an old logging road. He didn't get a plate, but he did radio a description of the men in their truck to the local sheriff's office. He also took our information and said he would pass it on to them. He waited around with us until Dad had fixed the car, and we were finally able to leave. We decided not to continue camping and instead drive a couple of hours to spend the last 2 days of the trip at the beach and stay in a hotel. A few days later, a deputy called my dad and told them that they never did find them, and he said that it was most likely a crime of opportunity after seeing a woman with 2 girls. He was sure they had been watching us from off the trail and had messed with our camp to judge how my dad would react when my dad seemed to be too big of a threat. They sabotaged our car, hoping to put us in a position where we were vulnerable. He said they would follow up with us if they found out anything else. But according to my dad, nothing ever came of it. Years later, I tried to do some research on crimes in that area of Oregon during the 80s that might have involved something like we experienced. But all I could really find was just a few reports of campers being robbed and a few cars being broken into. There was one case of a lady and her dog going missing from an area near there, but it was never determined what happened to her, or even if it was something bad, or if she just ran away. I can tell you that we did go back to that lake a few years later, and we had a very uneventful camping trip. It was nice to go back and really find some joy in a spot that was special to me. I really hope those guys never hurt anyone, and that maybe they were caught for other crimes. I will never know, though. I just hope to never run into a situation like that ever again. I can confidently say that having a dog along with us helped our situation. She was the hero and kept us alert. Ollie went on to live until she was 12 years old, and she passed with her favorite people around her. Remember to stay safe, stay watchful, and it never hurts to have a sweet, brave dog with you. I'm staying at a private campground in Vermont. I'm a 34-year-old female who's barely 5'3". This happened almost 3 weeks ago. It was on a Sunday night, right around the first week of August. I was sitting on the step in my camper with a fire going, smoking a bowl and drinking a beer. Another camper comes over. It's an older guy in his early to mid-40s, and he had asked to chill for a bit. I didn't think much of it, and he then left about an hour or so later. The rest of the night is pretty quiet, and I pass out the following day, which is a Monday. Everything is going normally until about 5 p.m. The door to my camper opens, and my dog starts going aggressive. I turn around and I see the same guy from the night before. Let's call him Bob. I quickly say, "What the hell are you doing in here? Get the hell out." And after some words back and forth, Bob finally leaves. I lock my door behind him, and I go about my day. 8:45 p.m. comes around, and I once again hear my dog growling. As soon as I look out the window, I see Bob. Within 3 seconds, he's gotten hold of the handle of my door, trying to open it for like 10 minutes while yelling to let him in. I was tempted to call the cops, but I figured I would go to management first. Tuesday comes around, and I sneak out to take my dog to the bathroom. I get back in with her, luckily, without issue. About 10 a.m. Bob is once again back pounding on my door, telling me to let him in. I yell at him no and to go away. He responded asking me to go hang out with him outside. Then I once again tell him no and to leave. This guy actually comes back 5 other times that day, doing the same thing, as well as trying to look through my windows, asking me to let him in. Well, 9 p.m. rolls around, and I'm curled up in bed with my dog. Within about 3 minutes, Bob was back trying to open the door to my camper, which thankfully was locked. While this is happening, I hear my boyfriend's bike coming up, and Bob bolts. The next day, he tries coming over, not knowing my boyfriend was with me. He then looks in the window and sees my boyfriend. Wednesday was pretty quiet for the most part until I went down to the bathrooms around noon. I hear a growl and bark as I'm headed to the bathroom. I get halfway there and I hear someone behind me. I don't think too much of it because there's a lot of people here. That's when I heard Bob asking me where I'm going. So I sped on my walk and I got into the bathroom, then quickly locked the stall door. Bob comes in and he then says, well, since we're both here, we might as well. And I then start yelling at him to get the hell out of there and to get away from me. He finally leave and I get back to my camper. Wednesday night, Bob started to come over, but when he saw my boyfriend's bike, he left me alone. Thursday morning comes around and I see Bob packing up and leaving. What a relief, finally he was gone all day on Thursday, but then Friday comes around, and around 11 a.m., I see Bob's camper placed near mine, so I head down to the front office to let them know what's going on. Well, come to find out, multiple people complained about him doing the same thing. One of my neighbors actually saw what happened Monday and Tuesday and complained to the office on my behalf. Luckily, he hasn't been back. The people he was with are still actually here. And I'm honestly on edge since I don't know if he'll show back up.